Again, hi, I'm Ken Johnson, and welcome to our fourth Time4Action webinar. Today, we're very honored and excited to have two great guests talk about the green jobs and the just transition. Hadrian Mertins-Kirkwood from the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives and Jim Stanford. Jim has graduate level degrees from Cambridge University and from the New School for Social Research, both in economics, I think. He worked for a long time with Unifor. He's written a great book called The Economics for Everyone, a guide to the economics of capitalism, an excellent book you may not know about. He also started, is the founding director of the, what is it called now, sorry, for the Center for Future Work that he started in Australia in 2016. He's now become the founding father for the same Center for Future Work in Vancouver. And I think you're coming to us from Vancouver, are you, Jim? Great, okay. We're having him on today because he just produced a more than 100-page report on the future of the transition of oil sands workers, or fossil fuel workers, to non-fossil fuel jobs. It's an excellent, detailed report, and from it, Environmental Defense has put out a very nice brochure. They took the information from it, put out about a 20-page brochure that's a little more visually accessible and contains a tremendous amount of great information. I'd highly recommend it. We'll put it in the chat later, the actual link to all the reports we're talking about today. Jim also, he didn't come up with this economic term, but he references it on occasion. It's the bullshit economic term that he's uses on occasion when it's appropriate. And hopefully he'll mention that later today. Hadrian Mertins-Kirkwood is senior researcher at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. He's the lead researcher on the zero carbon economy transition. And he's written a couple of very interesting reports related to that. One is the Making Decarbonation Work for Workers. And the other one is who's included in a just transition, where he's looking at beyond just the workers that are usually the only focus, but onto the communities. Also very interesting work. So I don't know if Adrian's come up with any new economics terms, but if he has, I hope he'll share them with us too. Now we'd like to start by sharing a 3.5-minute video that was put together, that Jim put together about the report he's just done.
The COVID pandemic has made it crystal clear that fossil fuel industries will never again be an engine of growth for Canada's economy. The pandemic has highlighted how fast the energy system is transitioning towards renewable. 33,000 jobs disappeared in Canadian fossil fuel industries between 2014 and 2019, and another 20,000 have disappeared during the pandemic. This is the time to move forward with an aggressive, compassionate plan to create jobs and facilitate transitions for fossil fuel workers and the communities where they live. Fossil fuel industries account for a surprisingly small share of total employment in Canada's labour market. Less than 1% of all jobs in Canada are in those industries. So over time, if we set a firm timetable and stick to it, the amount of reductions in employment from the phase out of fossil fuels is actually surprisingly modest, maybe 8,000 jobs per year over a 20-year period. For comparison purposes, Canada's labour market normally produces about 8,000 jobs every 10 days. It seems like a dramatic change to see the gradual phase out of all the jobs in fossil fuel industry. But Canada's experience is full of other examples of industries that declined over time or other industries that grew over time. In the 1901 census, the agriculture sector accounted for over 40% of all employment in Canada. Today, the number is 1.5%. In 1948, at the end of World War II, women made up just 21% of the workforce. Today, it's 48%, almost half. And families and communities, our whole economy, are much stronger because of it. We analyzed census data, and we found 18 communities in Canada where fossil fuel employment accounts for over 5% of all jobs in that community. One big city, Calgary, and then 17 smaller cities or towns. The good news is that's 18 communities out of the hundreds of communities across the country. And if we make it a national priority, it's totally doable to make the transition fair and reasonable. Some politicians say they're defending fossil fuel workers by trying to delay and deny the inevitable transition away from fossil fuel industries. That's not doing any favor for fossil fuel workers. They're already losing work, and their jobs are already being degraded with falling wages, falling health and safety conditions, and automation that replaces fossil fuel workers with machines in order to cut costs for their employers. The best thing to do for fossil fuel workers is recognize that this transition is happening, set a timetable and stick to it, and then give them the supports, the investments, the alternative jobs, and the early retirement incentives that are necessary so this transition can occur in an effective and humane way. Our report reviews the details of how many fossil fuel jobs there are in Canada, how we could transition away from fossil fuels without a painful disruption in our labor market, and 10 principles for how to manage that transition fairly and effectively. Please read our report for more detail.
Thanks.
Well,
Thanks, Ken, for showing us that. Thanks, Ken, for showing us that.
Anything more to say? That video pretty well nailed it in my book. A pretty compelling case. You have any questions left there?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Ken, for showing us that. And welcome, Hadrian and Jim. That was a pretty comprehensive video, and I hope it stimulates a lot of questions in the audience. And I have a lot of questions too. We're constantly being told that being bombarded with claims by big oil that they play a crucial role in the economy. But Jim, you seem to be portraying it as quite different from what Jason Kenney and others say. Can you tell us a little more about the role of fossil fuels in our economy?
Sure, Kathleen, thanks. And thanks for organizing this. I should point out to everyone, I noticed I'm wearing the same suit jacket that I had on in the video. But I do want to stress, I have changed my shirt and my underwear since that video was made. So, you know, I've got some personal hygiene going despite the pandemic here. So just to clarify that.
Well, if it works, it works.
Well, you're quite right, Kathleen. There's all kinds of propaganda, chest thumping that the petroleum industry and other fossil fuel vested interests put out about how important they are, and it's vastly overstated and sometimes absolutely just quite false. The technical term, Ken, that we use in economics is bullshit. Bullshit means hypothesis unsubstantiated by empirical verification. Okay, so that's where I define the terms as we go along. The reality,
I use that in my work as well, Jim. Thank you.
Now, we can't say that fossil fuel jobs aren't important. Every job is important in an economy where people don't have enough work and they don't have enough income and they don't have enough security. So I'm not for a second going to say fossil fuel jobs aren't important. They're really important for the people who have them and for the communities that are particularly dependent on them, those 18 communities in particular that we identified from the census data. In terms of the overall structure, though, and performance of Canada's economy, fossil fuel industries are small and shrinking. And this is the point. The trend over time is what I think is really important to draw out from our study. In 2019, fossil fuel industries, and I'm counting oil, petroleum, coal, and then industries which process and distribute those fuels, accounted for about 0.9% of total direct employment in Canada. And then, of course, it's fallen since then because of the pandemic. There was another obviously big wave of job losses in fossil fuel sectors. So something like 0.8%. It's been shrinking over time. In fact, the pace of its relative decline as a share of total employment since 2014. 2014 is when the industry really started to contract. That pace is consistent with the ultimate phase out of fossil fuel industries over a 20-year period. If it continues shrinking at that pace, it will reach zero as a share of total employment in 20 years, which is the timetable we simulate in this report. So the idea that phasing out fossil fuels will destroy the economy, absolutely wrong. In fact, Canada's labor market performed very well in the years up till the pandemic, when even as fossil fuel jobs were contracting. And the idea that we can't find other things to produce, to export, to support ourselves is just blatantly false. We have a very diversified modern economy in Canada. We have lots of things that we can be doing, including renewable energy, but renewable energy is just one small part of the overall set of other activities that we can be engaging in.
Well, we'll get into that sooner or later. Hadrian, I just wondered if you have the same reaction. I mean, we really are, as I said before, bombarded with this idea that Canada, well, I mean, it's even been called a petrostate. Harper wanted it to be a superpower. And do you have have you come to the same conclusion as Jim, that we can do it? We can gear down in that industry or those industries and survive well?
Absolutely. I mean, I think Jim's got it completely right. And I guess the two details I'll add is it's worth thinking about when we talk about the contribution of an industry to the economy. GDP is not really a very useful measure. What we actually care about is jobs. We care about things like public revenue, for example. And on both of those fronts, the oil and gas industry is a lot smaller than it looks, even on paper, in terms of GDP. For a couple of reasons. One is that when you have a downturn like we've had for the last several years of low oil prices, the way that the royalty regimes work in Canada is that a lot of these companies are paying very little in royalty revenues. So I learned recently that Newfoundland and Labrador, which has one of the larger oil industries in Canada, actually generated more public revenue from liquor sales in the past year than it did from oil revenues. And in provinces like Alberta and Saskatchewan, even though they have a lot of what seems to be a lot of investment in oil and gas, the problem is those industries are very capital intensive. They're not very labor intensive. And that means you could invest the exact same amount of money in other industries and generate a lot more jobs. And that's good news for us because it means we can invest in industries that aren't oil and gas, spend a lot less money in total, and still preserve and create as much employment as we see today in the fossil fuel sectors.
And probably the profits wouldn't be going out of the country to foreign-owned companies. I just want to get back.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I just want to get back to the state of the workers. I hadn't, until I started researching this, I hadn't really realized that oil and gas workers have a pretty difficult lot. They fly into man camps and their lives are dangerous. Few unions. Can you just elaborate on that, Jim?
Well, there's a huge diversity of different jobs in fossil fuel industry, so we can't generalize. There are some people who have jobs like that, Kathleen, the fly-in, fly-out arrangements, especially say in northern Alberta around Fort McMurray and so on. Here's a surprising fact, though. Over half of all fossil fuel jobs, direct jobs in fossil fuel industries, are in cities. So that goes right against the stereotype of the roughneck, out in the bush somewhere drilling an oil well. Most fossil fuel workers are in cities, and they're doing office jobs, technical jobs, computer jobs, technology jobs, some manufacturing and distribution jobs. So it's important to have a view on what actually these jobs are, not just their relatively small number in the grand scope of things, but also where they're regionally distributed and what are the skills and actual careers that they include. Now, for the production workers in remote locations, they do face very challenging situations, including often working far from where their homes and families are, transportation time, which is typically unpaid, the obviously mental and physical stress of living in remote locations. Health and safety is a big issue, of course. I mean, there's just lots of inherent dangers in this type of work, given the machinery and the physical settings that they're in. And the record of the industry on working conditions, health and safety, compensation, and so on has been slipping badly. You know, this old idea that, you know, you had a gold mine on your hands if you got an oil and gas job is not remotely true anymore. It never was true, but it's not remotely true now. Real wages in the sector have been falling, in part because the industry's profits have been squeezed by the decline in sales and the decline in oil prices. And they've been inadequate in terms of health and safety protection. And now you see the oil companies and Jason Kenney's government and so on trying to take stuff away, like they've changed the workers' compensation system in Alberta so that injured workers have much less chance of getting a job back. They've changed the overtime rules so that some of the regulations regarding how those people who'd go in for two week straight shifts, how they would get paid overtime for their extra hours, all ways to try and squeeze workers. So when Jason Kenney and the energy CEOs stand up and say, you know, we're the biggest friends of the oil workers and we're here to defend them, they should be struck by lightning, frankly, when they say that, because they are absolutely doing everything they can to squeeze workers, to fatten the bottom line of this industry for as long as the sun shines on it. They know this industry is going to disappear, and they're intent on making as much money as they can while the getting is good. And workers are the sacrificial lambs in that. So if we really support workers in the fossil fuel industry, first of all, we got to give them power and union voice and regulatory supports so that their jobs, while they have them, are decent and safe. And then second, we've got to say this industry is disappearing. Everyone knows it. Let's put in place a plan that makes sense, that is supportive and gradual, and so that this change can be done without catastrophe for those workers and their families and communities.
Well, again, what about the 50,000 workers who've already been laid off since 2014? Hadrian, do you know if Jason Kenney is taking care of them since he thinks they're such valuable human beings?
Well, not in particular, no. We've seen the government, I mean, it was not Kenney's government, but Alberta did bring in transition supports for coal workers in that province in response to the phase out of coal power. The problem for governments like Kenney's and the federal government, frankly, is they're having a hard time. The idea of bringing in place transition programs for fossil fuel workers would be an acknowledgement that a transition is happening. And so far, governments at all levels are still in denial about this transition away from oil and gas specifically. They've acknowledged it with coal, but they're afraid to admit it with oil and gas. But as long as they don't admit that this transition is happening, it makes it hard for them to put in place the supports that those workers require.
And Hadrian, you've written about more marginalized workers or workers who are more indirectly dependent on the fossil fuel industry. What's happening with them, and what are you hoping will happen with them?
Yeah, so this is one of the challenges, is that in all of these communities, even you pick a place like Fort McMurray, which is by many measures the most oil dependent community in the country. But most people in Fort McMurray, most workers are not oil workers. They work in the service sector, they work in the healthcare sector, they work in all other kinds of parts of the economy, often to support oil workers. But that means when the oil industry winds down, when projects shut down for whatever reason, whether it's policy or just economics, it's not just oil workers that are left in the lurch. It's also all these other people that work in the community in these kinds of indirect and spin-off jobs. So we just need to be aware of that, because the kinds of workers in especially service work, retail work, are disproportionately women, racialized workers. They're more likely to be immigrants and so on. And they often don't get the same attention and the same support that fossil fuel workers do. So we need to be careful when we talk about this transition that we're including everyone who's vulnerable, and not just a very narrow sense of who qualifies as a fossil fuel worker.
And also, Jim, you point out that only 18, you pointed out in your video that only 18 census-defined communities, there are only where there are over 5% of fossil fuel workers. So we're not, again, getting back to what we were saying before, we're not talking about the whole country. We're talking about 18 communities. Is that right?
Yeah, that's a very important and challenging dimension of the transition problem that we're facing, is the fact that fossil fuel jobs are not evenly spread across the country for the obvious reason, duh, fossil fuels are not evenly spread across the country. So Alberta is by far the most dependent on fossil fuels of any province, Saskatchewan and Newfoundland next. In average across Canada in 2019, it was only 0.9% of all jobs, but in a place like Fort McMurray, it's over 30% of all jobs. So we tried to get a handle on, where are the regional concentrations, because I think those are going to be the hardest nuts to crack in terms of supporting an effective transition. Fort McMurray is the extreme, both because of the scale of its dependence on fossil fuel jobs and its remoteness. It is a city, but it's far, far away from other places, and it's going to be hard, let's be honest, about recruiting other industries to go up there and create these sort of alternative jobs that we need. I think some of that can be done, and I argue in the report for things like targeting investment in important public service facilities and centers to places like Fort McMurray to assist them in the transition. But the reality is a lot of people went up to Fort McMurray for an oil job, and when the oil jobs are gone, a lot of them are going to leave Fort McMurray. And we might as well facilitate and support that process as well. If people want to stay in Fort McMurray, it's a lively young community, then by all means do so, and they have to be supported there as well. We counted 18 communities where we just picked a threshold, 5% of total jobs as being relatively dependent on fossil fuels. One of them is the big city, Calgary, and that of course is already transitioning. I'm very impressed with how Calgary is already rebranding itself as a technology center rather than an oil and gas capital, and seeing all of the companies, new head offices that are moving to Calgary. First of all, because there's high skilled available workers there. Secondly, office space is very cheap right now. Thirdly, it's a great city with a great quality of life. I grew up in Calgary, and I would move a head office there too if I could. So that's already happening. I'm not too worried about Calgary, although the people there need to be supported through this. It's the smaller, more remote locations that have the higher concentration of fossil fuel work that are going to need, I think, the targeted, focused support. But because this is a national economic and environmental priority, we should put national attention and resources into this. And we absolutely could. If we view this as a 20-year process, and as Hadrian said, he's bang on, what we have to do is identify that it's happening first, and then set timetables and support it as you go, rather than trying to deny and delay the whole thing. If we set this as a 20-year process, we could provide an enormous amount of support for every single fossil fuel worker in every one of those communities who needed assistance and retraining and adjustment and income insurance and help selling their house and moving somewhere else if they choose to do that. The whole gamut of supports, a very generous package for each and every worker, and it might cost $1 billion a year for 20 years, which is nothing in the grand scheme of the investments that are going to go into transforming our whole energy system. So if we think of it in that term as a process that's going to happen where we can enlist the ordinary forces of labor market adjustment towards that goal, it can absolutely be done. It's affordable, and we could do it in a very compassionate way.
If we were compassionate. Hadrian, I know that the labor market is more fluid than most of us are given the sense of. Does that give you hope that there'll be more room for the transition?
Yeah, this is actually something that Jim talks about in his report that's really helpful, is just that there's a lot of turnover already. And it's one of the key reasons why having a timeline for the transition is so valuable. If we know that we've got a 20-year timeline or 30-year timeline, whatever it is, it makes the kind of natural adjustment of the labor market just kind of happen without a lot of heavy-handed policy. And we started to see, we've seen that already with the coal transition. The federal government set a 2030 deadline. By 2030, with some exceptions, there'll be no more coal power in the country. And that's helpful for everybody. It's helpful for young workers when they're choosing a career and they realize, oh, by the time I'm mid-career, this industry won't exist. I'm going to choose a different one. It's helpful for the private sector to manage their investments. It's helpful for the public sector to plan transition supports and so on. So those timelines are really, really important. And yeah, as Jim says, if 10% of the workforce is turning over every year, over the course of 20 years, all those people are going to end up in retirement anyway, or end up in new jobs anyway. The real challenging part is making sure we're not putting new people to work in this sector. That's the real danger. If we're training young people to work in oil and gas now, we're really setting them up for failure. But it's much less of a problem for someone who's 55 right now working in the oil industry. They can finish out their career. That's not a problem.
You both talk about a timeline and a slow and just transition. What is Ottawa doing, if anything, to help this along? Is there any sense that they're going to look at a timeline or create a timeline or transition smoothly?
Well,
Jim?
the government has promised a Just Transition Act. That's a federal government promise, and it's in fact in the mandate letter for a couple of the ministers. So I think they have a sense of how this is going to be an important part of the puzzle. And as Hadrian mentioned, the feds and the Alberta government did participate in this coal transition program, which was not perfect, but I think was an important precedent and had some very beneficial supports there as part of a transition away from coal power in Alberta, which, by the way, happened much faster than the transition plan planned for, precisely because the economics of renewable energy have changed so dramatically. The companies, private companies, said, "I'm not sticking with coal. I'm going for renewables," and that's happened much more quickly than was planned. So this is exactly what's going to happen elsewhere in the fossil fuel sector as well. On the other hand, the feds face tremendous pressure from the oil industry, from Alberta, and the kind of regional politics that shake out in Canada, and have been, not strong enough in terms of setting the timetable and the resources that are going to have to be required for it. So I would like to see the federal government come out with the Just Transition Act. I would like to see them fund it with a decent amount in this budget, in this year's budget, and every year's budget afterwards. And that will kind of get the ball rolling on this and send a very important signal that they recognize this transition is inevitable. And so we might as well do it right.
Thank you. Hadrian, you talk about reactive and proactive policies in terms of bringing a just transition into being. Can you just define them? Reactive, proactive?
Yeah, it's sort of a kind of conceptual framework, but the important point is that often when we talk about the transition away from fossil fuels, that's where the conversation stops. We're talking about the transition out of an old economy, and we know that's what we have to do, and we know that's what's kind of happening anyway, regardless of our climate policies. The problem is if we transition out of an industry but not into anything new, we're in trouble, or at least those workers and communities are in trouble. So that's why I talk about in my work about a proactive just transition that thinks about the future as well. So we're not just transitioning out of fossil fuels, we're also transitioning into a lower carbon economy. So I think that a just transition needs to have both those reactive elements of supporting people, but also proactive elements about investing in a lower carbon economy, especially in job creating investments.
Anything to say about that, Jim? I'm sure you do.
I agree with what Hadrian's said. It's going to happen, and I guess the one point that I am stressing as well, there's a tendency when we think about energy transitions and the job effects to just kind of connect dot A, which is fossil fuels phasing out, with dot B, which is renewable energy growing, and therefore draw a line between them and say that's what the employment transition is going to look like. We're going to take people out of fossil fuel industries and put them to work building solar panels and windmills. Now, there are going to be some jobs building solar panels and windmills, and we should do everything we can to make sure we've got more of those jobs in Canada rather than importing all that stuff, and make sure they're good jobs in terms of the wages and union representation and labor standards and so on. But the reality, the simple math is the jobs in point B in renewable energy are going to be very small themselves, just like the jobs in fossil fuels are very small. It's a very small slice of the overall economy. And in the end, I suspect we'll have as many jobs in renewables as we had in fossil fuels. So I think it'll be a net wash in terms of the total number of jobs. Some people argue there'll be more. Some people argue there'll be less. I tend to think it'll probably be about the same, but it's going to be small. That's the point. And so why do we want to limit the whole discussion of transition to say, fossil fuel worker, here's a job probably in a different community with a different set of skills, making windmills. Why don't you go and apply to that? And the reality is there's 98% of the rest of the economy, which are the other things that that fossil fuel worker could be doing that might be much more appropriate, along with the whole process of gradual adjustment, which, as Hadrian was saying earlier, most fossil fuel workers are actually going to retire. They're not going to go and find another job. They're going to retire. So I think if we have, in a way, a more fulsome understanding of how the labor market adjusts to changes and the whole range of options that are open to fossil fuel workers, just one of which is go and find a job in renewables, I think it will look a lot more reasonable than just saying you've got A and B and we have to get people from A to B.
Thanks. Hadrian, what about our apprenticeship and training programs across the country? Are they in good shape, not just for former fossil fuel workers, but just generally?
Well, good shape. I mean, we're doing okay, but we definitely have a lot of looming skill shortages on the horizon. We already have skill shortages in a lot of the building trades and other occupations. Definitely have some more on the horizon. And the other thing we don't do really well, especially in the skilled trades in Canada, is encourage workers from diverse backgrounds to be part of those trades. They're overwhelmingly dominated by white Canadian-born men right now. And moving forward, we need to do a better job of diversifying that clean economy workforce. And it's, but in terms of like how well we're doing overall, we really need to kind of set the bar higher and look at countries like Germany that have really well managed training programs that make sure they're actually matching labor market needs with labor supply. There's a lot we can be doing better in Canada.
Well, on that note, I'll just finish up my question period here with just, it seems like this is an opportunity for Canada really generally to be more just and fair. Can you just tell us what we should be doing just to push us in that better direction? This is it's an opportunity to improve the country and workers' conditions generally. Can you comment on that, Jim?
Sure. Yeah, it's an opportunity in so many ways, Kathleen. It's obviously an opportunity and a necessity environmentally. We have to do this. We have to do it economically as well. Like whatever we might think about climate change and whether it should be addressed or not, and we know on this call that it has to be. Even if you dispute that, the reality is the rest of the world is going to stop buying Canadian fossil fuels, whether we want it or not, just like the rest of the world stopped buying Canadian beaver pelts. Okay, there's a whole history of staple export-oriented products that Canadians have made over our history that came and went. And they went not generally because we ran out of them, but because foreign tastes and technologies changed and they didn't want it anymore. And that's exactly what's happening with fossil fuels. So this is a necessity, but it's also an opportunity because the economic benefits of huge investments in renewable energy are obvious. The spin-offs, the efficiency benefits, the infrastructure improvements, and the jobs that can be created as part of it. If we do this right, we can do it to maximize the upside and minimize the downside. And Hadrian mentioned the German example of the apprenticeship system, which I love. Another German example we could follow is how they phased out the black coal mining industry in Germany, 80,000 jobs over a 20-year period. And they did it without a single involuntary layoff. By setting timetables, giving people options, facilitating retirements and early retirements, creating alternative jobs for some of the affected workers, and a very strong skills system that allowed people who wanted to get retrained. I think we could commit to doing this without a single involuntary layoff in Canada as well. I think that would be doable and logical, and it would completely change the politics of this discussion. If the governments could come and say, fossil fuels are going to disappear over 20 years, but no fossil fuel worker is going to involuntarily lose their job. We will guarantee alternative work or income or early retirement or one of all these other options of adjustment. And we'll end up with a stronger, fairer labor market, just as you say, Kathleen.
I think you agree, Hadrian.
Yeah, no, I have nothing to add. I'm happy to get to audience questions.
Okay, well, Ken has a couple. I think he's going to ask you about the Just Transition Act. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thanks, Kathleen. The Just Transition Act has been mentioned. And Hadrian, you said you were doing some work on that. Maybe you could comment more on that.
Yeah, so this was a promise that the Liberal government included in its platform in the last federal election. And then, as Jim mentioned, after they were elected, it was included in a number of ministerial mandate letters to introduce legislation to support workers and communities in the transition to a cleaner economy. So and this got a lot of people excited. It certainly got me excited, this idea of a Just Transition Act. It's something that activists, unions, workers have been calling for a long time. We haven't really heard anything about it since then. So I am working on some new research with Clay Duncalf, who's a grad student at Carleton University, to try and to think through what this act could look like and how could we raise the bar for a just transition in Canada. So hoping to publish that in the next month or two.
Thank you. Jim, you mentioned the transition in Germany, but in the report you have a number of places: the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, Spain, Ontario, and the United States. I'm wondering if you'd like to just talk about a couple other examples, because of course examples where they successfully do transition are very important for making the case compelling.
Yeah, part of what we do in the report is show that the transition we're looking at away from fossil fuel jobs is not unprecedented, first of all. And, as I just mentioned, there's lots of historical examples in Canada of industrial transitions that were actually bigger proportionately than the one we're looking at with fossil fuels. Now, some of those were handled very badly. Think about the fishing industry in Atlantic Canada and Newfoundland in particular, where they confronted an environmental breakdown, and they suddenly had to lay off 10% of their provincial labor force in the 90s with the cod crisis. That is a textbook case of how not to do a transition, which is to wait until change, painful, dramatic, chaotic change is forced upon you. So what we're looking at with fossil fuels is not unprecedented, and is actually not undoable in terms of its size. We also looked at examples where transitions were planned and supported rather than being left to the devices of market competition and private business decisions. And there are some good examples. I mentioned the German one. The Netherlands had another situation where they phased out their coal mining industry earlier, starting in the 1970s, and also did it without an involuntary layoff, also supported by a whole network of alternative job creation, phased retirements, and retraining. And they had a great slogan, actually, that I love. I forget what was it, no transition without a new job, or something like that. It's mentioned in the report, but ties that precondition that you have to have something else to go to, and there'll be no forced redundancies that I think is so important. Here closer to home, we phased out the Ontario coal-fired electricity system without a single involuntary layoff in the 2000s. That was in fact still the biggest single emissions reduction policy action in North American history. And it was done without chaos. How was it done? Planning, timetable. They did the whole thing over about a 10-year period, phased shutdowns of different coal-fired stations. They negotiated with the unions involved, retraining, relocation, early retirement incentives. And they put in place a certain amount of alternative work. There's two of the facilities that now run on biomass rather than coal, and that kept some of the work. So that's another example of how it can be done. Lots of places around the world, trying to look at this transition puzzle and solve it, but there's enough evidence now to know that it absolutely can be done.
I think the cod fishery is a classic example of ignore the science and pay for it with work, and workers pay for it in a big way. Because the fisheries, I know the fisheries scientists in the federal government were saying for years, the fishery, we're going to lose it if we're not more careful. And the politicians just kept ignoring it. And then suddenly it just completely collapsed. And I know they were talking about it coming back in a couple of years, but we're 25 years later, and I don't think it's come back. Anything you want to say about that? Any more you want to say about that?
Yeah, it's a painful example. Another painful example is the forestry and forest products industry here in BC, where I'm based now. Also an environmental dimension there because of climate, drought, pine beetle, which is infestation tied to climate change, as well as economic factors like the recession in the US after the global financial crisis. They ended up losing tens of thousands of forestry jobs, and there were bits and pieces of support and transition measures, but not nearly enough. So, you know, there's good examples from history and bad examples from history. And for God's sakes, we should be able to learn from history and do this one right.
Do you have anything to add to that, Hadrian?
No, I don't. I think Jim's covered all the important points there.
Yeah, he's like that. Thank you. Okay, I'd like to go to some questions from the audience. First one, Hadrian, when you include the spin-off jobs, are you still talking about less than 1% of the jobs in Canada? That was the first question that came in.
Yeah, it's a good question. It depends kind of on your methodology about what you include. It could be a bit over 1% if you're including indirect jobs, but it's important to note that a lot of those indirect jobs are things like construction, for example. And while you know there's the risk that construction workers who are building oil sands projects lose their jobs, in practice they can start building other kinds of infrastructure. So although there is still a risk to those kinds of indirect jobs, it's not the same thing as direct fossil fuel employment. And that's even more so for induced jobs. So I mentioned earlier service and retail and so on. Those jobs aren't at risk as long as we can scale up alternative industries to replace those oil projects in those communities. As long as we have alternative kind of bedrock industries, then we aren't putting any of those indirect and induced jobs at risk.
The next question was, of course, a lot of jobs get created every month, but they aren't all of the same. The argument, of course, is they aren't all of the same value in terms of pay. So Carolyn Herbert is asking, how does pay of the newer jobs compare? A relative stats that where he lives, it takes a salary of $75,000 to support the family. Please address this concern. Jim, do you want to take that on first?
Sure. Some fossil fuel jobs have higher than average income. Not all, but some do. Now, a couple of things to keep in mind. Number one, the higher incomes for some of those fossil fuel jobs, to some extent, reflect the difficult conditions that they face, the fly in, fly out, the long hours, the hazardous conditions. So, you know, you can't necessarily compare how much income a tradesperson in a remote oil sands camp makes in the course of a year. They could easily be making $150,000 a year, but look at the hours and hardship that they go through. So you got to take those into account. Secondly, real wages in the fossil fuel sector, throughout the fossil fuel sector, there's data on this in my report, are falling because those industries are suppressing labor costs to try and improve their profit margins, given the negative outlook for the industry. So the gap between even the better paid fossil fuel workers and the rest of the labor market is shrinking. Third, part of our challenge for a good transition is to make attractive opportunities elsewhere in the labor market. So that's one reason why part of this, part of an effective transition plan is to have a very vibrant macroeconomic environment where you're trying to get the unemployment rate as close to zero as you can, creating as many jobs as you can as a top priority. That's obviously been complicated by the pandemic, but that will still be the top priority, should still be the top priority. And lift the quality of those other jobs, including through higher minimum wages, more trade union representation, and so on. So some fossil fuel jobs are relatively high income jobs, not all, and there's downward pressure on them. And part of the solution to that is to say we have to lift the quality of jobs throughout the labor market as part of our transition strategy.
Do you have any, can you give us any actual numbers or stats on the changing pay that fossil fuel workers are getting, the decreasing wages?
Sure, there's a whole section in the report, and I've sent the link around in the chat. I'll send it around again because I know the chat kind of flies by. A whole section documenting the extent of the decline in real wages in, I think, every fossil fuel subsector. Oil and gas production, mining services, coal mining, petrochemicals. I think the one sector that actually had real wage increases was natural gas distribution, in part, again, because of the work of unions in that sector. But on the whole, the pressure is clearly, and the trend is clearly down. So the claim that these are good jobs is less and less valid.
Someone, Roz Isaac in the comments said, perhaps all these oil and gas workers can go to BC's fracked gas industry. And I'm not sure that's exactly the solution we're looking for, but maybe, Hadrian, do you want to comment on that at all?
Well, I think that natural gas is a real challenge because it's being framed as this transition opportunity for Canada because it's less emissions intensive than coal. But at the end of the day, natural gas is a fossil fuel. It's making climate change worse, and we don't need kind of transition fuels. We can go right to totally clean sources of power. So we really, even though there are jobs in natural gas, that's not the solution or the panacea here. We should be moving past that directly to clean infrastructure.
Jim, you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, certainly Hadrian's right. The gas industry faces the same global challenges as other fossil fuels, and the day when it could be credibly described as a transition fuel are long gone. Other renewable fuels are cheaper and obviously cleaner. This is in a way a last gasp effort by the petroleum industry to try and save some of their profits, but absolutely it's not the solution. I've spent some time in Australia lately where they jumped on the liquefied natural gas bandwagon in a huge way. And they don't have the same environmental protections and reviews, and they don't have the same obligation to negotiate with Indigenous communities either. So they rampaged ahead and they built, get this, 6 LNG plants within a 5-year period. You know, we're having a great fight in Canada over one. They built 6 within a 5-year period, 3 of them on the same island, a remote tropical island off the northeast coast of the country. And it's the biggest economic disaster, I think, in human history, because every one of those plants costs 20, 30, 40 billion dollars. They're enormously expensive, and they're all white elephants. And the companies involved have written off billions and billions of dollars of wasted costs. So every time, you know, the National Post writes about Canada's burdensome environmental regulations slowing down the LNG industry, this is where we should all thank our lucky stars for those burdensome regulations, because they saved us from one of the greatest white elephants in human history.
Well, I think they had something like 13 LNG plants planned for up and down the BC coast, if I recall correctly.
Well, there's only one of them that's being built, and the others, frankly, don't stand a chance economically.
Okay, thank you. Maybe, Hadrian, you could talk briefly about the abandoned well cleanup program and how it fits into your proposals. That's a question from Gail Greer.
Yeah, that's a really it's a good question and an important piece here. I mean, on the one hand, it's really bad news that we have this environmental disaster left behind by decades of fossil fuel extraction. And the private sector, even though it was in theory on the hook for cleanup, in practice hasn't done that. A lot of especially smaller exploration companies in Alberta basically have just gone bankrupt and then left their oil wells behind. It's a huge mess, and it's going to take decades of work to reclaim that land. So yes, it's bad news, but that's also an opportunity to create a lot of jobs in reclamation. And it's a natural transition for at least some of those workers who are currently working in fossil fuels. As Jim said earlier, it's not a one-to-one transition. We don't need it to be a one-to-one transition, but it's one opportunity. But what's important for that to happen is, at the end of the day, is public money. If these private companies aren't going to clean up these wells themselves, then we need governments to step in, employ people, and make a plan to clean up these wells, which is, again, important not just for environmental reasons, but also as a big economic opportunity in the medium term for a lot of these workers.
Jim, you have anything to add to that?
No, Hadrian and I are a good tag team here.
Absolutely. That's why we chose you. The all of the above approach of the Liberal government. Jim, would you like to comment on that at all?
Well, I'm not quite sure what that's getting at. I guess it's the kind of the Liberal tendency to try and sound like you're doing the right thing, but not sort of, you know, get right behind it, and also trying to keep happy the fossil fuel interests and manage the regional issues, regional political issues as well. So I don't think whoever's in power, we should expect them to deliver what we need on a silver platter. I am constantly reminded of the necessity of the battle of ideas. And this is why we're putting forward these arguments, and whoever's in office, including obviously the current government, has to be pressured to do the right thing. And, you know, it's our movements, and armed with our facts and figures and our passion and our commitment to a sustainable world, that will win the day at the end, whether they're liberals or someone else there.
With all of the above, one of the things they were talking about was small nuclear reactors. Care to comment on transition to them?
That's outside of my expertise. Sorry.
Hadrian?
I think what I'll say about that is even putting aside all of the issues of nuclear power and the waste and the cleanup, which has been a known issue for a long time, these small modular reactors are a kind of prospective technology. They're the kind of thing that like could help us in 10 or 20 years, and we just don't have that much time. We already have technologies today that work. We already know how to decarbonize our power system. So there's no reason to wait and bank on future technologies, nuclear or otherwise. We need to move ahead fast with the technologies we know work.
Thank you. Angela Keller-Herzog asked, the new conservative leader has mentioned that his top priority is jobs. Do we know more about that plan?
I haven't seen a jobs plan from this guy. All I've seen is a great big PR campaign to try and label him a kinder, gentler conservative, which, what was that term I used earlier? Oh yeah, bullshit.
Bullshit, operative term. I knew it would come up sometime during the hour, Jim, thank you. You want to comment, either of you want to comment more on the role that wind, solar, and geothermal opportunities in Alberta, BC, and Saskatchewan could have, and the supporting role of iron and earth in the transitioning?
Well, I would say, first of all, that Alberta and Saskatchewan especially, but really all of Canada is really well suited to renewable power generation. We have all of the kind of natural resources we need. And we just need the investment to kind of kickstart those projects. I mean, South Korea just recently announced, I think, a $43 billion offshore wind project. And that's kind of scale of investment we need in Canada. So far, we're getting kind of millions of dollars being spent by governments, or they'll say billions of dollars, but it's over like 15 years or whatever. So we just need to scale up a lot of that technology, and we need both the provincial and federal governments to do that. As for Iron and Earth, it's a really important, valuable organization. For those who aren't familiar, it's not a labor union, but it represents workers in the fossil fuel industries who want to make the transition to cleaner, to work in cleaner industries, and they put together plans to do that, and they're lobbying federal government to help make that happen as well. So they're playing a valuable role kind of from the inside of the oil and gas industry.
Jim?
Ken, are there more questions? Because we could show, we're trying to promote Iron and Earth this week. They've got a petition and they've got a video. Have we got more questions, or should we show the video and show the petition? We'll post both on the in the chat, but this is a wonderful group. As Hadrian said, they're trying to promote green energy projects, and they're building some green energy projects. So should we look at it now?
Yeah, we could have a look at that as soon as it'll pop up. In the meantime, Jim, I just had one more question for Jim in particular. Jim, with this stage transition, this 8,000 jobs a year, that of course would be optimal and academic. How would you see it in reality actually playing out? Because of course it's going to be uneven, and you've got all these different companies and different policies and stuff. I'm just wondering, beyond sort of the theoretical, we do 8,000 a year and that gets us to none in 20 years. Providing more subtlety to how you'd imagine it would actually play out, or it has in other places. But it seems like
that's a very important point when you get down to the nitty gritty of how does it actually happen. Now, the 8,000, remember, most of that is going to be taken up with retirements if we do it gradually. So it's not like we have to find 8,000 new jobs a year. We won't even have to find 4,000 new jobs a year if we stage that. But then the question you raised, Ken, is how do you do it given the lumpiness, if you like, of the fossil fuel jobs in different locations with different companies with different production facilities?
Lumpiness, is that an economic term, Jim?
Yeah, one of my many. What you have to do is that this is where you really need the plan. You need the plan to operate on an industry-wide basis so that when you close one facility, for example, you want to do one, not all of them at once. We want to do them gradually. When you close that one, well, some of the people who work there are going to be able to take early retirement, but not all of them. So what do you do with the younger people? Well, this is where the ability to plan on an industry-wide basis becomes so important. What you could do is then offer senior workers in other locations that are still operating, offer them an early retirement incentive, then give the younger workers at the facility that's closing the opportunity to move to one of those other locations that's still in business. But that requires the ability to plan on an industry-wide basis, perhaps even across companies, which is challenging because you're now going to put some constraints on the individual firm's decision-making ability about those particular locations. They may wish to shut them all at once if, in fact, they decide that's the best way to handle it for their own profits. We might actually have to be pushing some of them to keep the things operating in order to facilitate this steady transition. That's exactly how it's happened to some extent in Australia with the coal-fired power plants. You've got private ownership of each individual power plant, which is a disaster anyways. But then each one of them is going to make a decision about which one they're going to shut when, based on their own profitability, including hoping that shutting a power plant is going to drive up the spot price of electricity and fatten their profits. So this is how we have to challenge the dominance of private profit over the whole process. They did things like that planning in the Ontario Hydro case that I mentioned. It's happened in other industries. The auto industry, which I'm familiar with from my days with Unifor, does that all the time. Across a chain of plants run by a company, you get the mobility and you offer incentives at the senior end to people in every location. But it does mean an ability to plan rather than just trusting the market to take care of it all.
And then just follow up on that. Do you think the oil industry or the individual companies are likely to ever embrace that kind of plan?
Well, that's a good question. They can be pushed to embrace it, and both through requirements through a Just Transition Act that they have to, presumably combined with some kind of incentives or carrots to have the companies participate. You know, if they want access to some of the transition opportunities, then they'll have to sign on to this. In the end, this is how they did it in the German coal industry. The government nationalized the industry as the precursor for shutting it down, because the ability to plan and impose this logic across the whole industry, they deemed to be more effective in a state-run setting. And we saw that with the Ontario Hydro phase out of coal-fired generation as well. So I think there's an argument in here to nationalize the whole oil industry in order to shut it down. That sounds counterintuitive, and there'd be a whole bunch of environmentalists screaming about that idea. But from the perspective of what I'm imagining, it could conceivably be quite helpful.
Well, maybe that's why the Liberal government bought the Trans Mountain Pipeline as a start on that. Jim,
Maybe.
do you have any comment on that?
Maybe. I'm not sure that's what they had in mind, but if it sets a precedent to say, you know, anyways, I'll leave it at that.
Hadrian, anything to say on that topic?
No, I don't think so. Although I should just correct myself. I made a comment earlier and someone asked me for a source about Newfoundland and Labrador getting more revenues from liquor sales than offshore oil. So that's not actually true. And then I found the numbers. It's just a lot closer this year than in the past. And the oil companies required public investment of millions of dollars. Although in the end, there was still more public money from oil revenues than from liquor. So I apologize for misstating that earlier, but it is surprisingly close.
We've got a pretty sharp audience, Hadrian. You're not
yeah. Well, thanks for calling me out on that.
Okay. Thanks. I'm going to try and show this Iron and Earth video now. It's just a minute long.
Thanks, Ken. Thanks for showing that. I have to admit I've watched it, but
We're trying to get it to stop.
I have to admit I've watched that about 15 times. First of all, I like the music, and seeing all those young guys being trained to work in green industry just makes me almost weep. So I just hate to see them being manipulated by Jason Kenney and people like that. So we really appreciate the two of you showing that these guys don't have to be the victims of the oil industry and people like Kenny. And thank goodness for Iron and Earth. They've also got a petition. Can you put that on the screen, or should we just post it?
Try and get that up.
So we'll post the petition, the link to the petition, if people could sign it. Iron and Earth deserve, they're in the belly of the beast, and they deserve as much support and credit as we can give them. And don't forget, Time4Action is supposed to be about action. So this is our action this week.
Celine, let me just supplement that. I think Iron and Earth is a great group, and they're very creative in how they're reaching out. Remember, workers in the fossil fuel sector have organized voice as well through their trade unions. So my former union, Unifor, and others in the sector have been, I think, outstanding in terms of recognizing the positive potential here and the necessity of taking our heads out of the sand and moving forward. So we should be working as closely as we can with the unions in this sector as well.
Well, I sent an invitation to Ken Bondi just for that very reason.
Yeah, Ken was on this call, as was Joey Warnock and some of the others. And apart from this network, they're doing great work, saying that you're not doing fossil fuel workers any favors by pretending that this isn't happening. This is the main way to attack Kenny's position, I think.
Yeah. Well, anything more, Hadrian?
Well, no, I think that's a good point to end on, is that this really isn't a choice about whether or not we do a transition. It's a choice between an unmanaged, unplanned, and unjust transition, or one that is actually responsive to and supportive of workers and their communities. That's the choice we face, and that's what we should be focusing our energies on.
And I also think, given that Donald Gutstein spoke last week about the neoliberal agenda and the neoliberalism taking over all our governments for the last 30 years, you've both made the point that the government has to be a real player in this. We can't leave it up to the market. And I think that, to me, is one of the most important messages to finish on. So Ken's going to put up the poster for next week. And we're going to have another very special guest, Seth Klein. And a lot of you might have already heard interviews with Seth Klein. He was on The Current, and he's really got a lot of attention with this wonderful book, A Good War. But we're going to concentrate on actions. We're not going to get him to describe the World War II and the basis of his reasoning behind what we can do. But we're going to talk about what we can do here and now, according to what he saw, what was done in the Second World War, and what he sees possible now. So it will be a very action-oriented discussion. So I hope you can join us. And I'm really thrilled that the Unifor people joined us. That makes me, I think, makes the whole webinar more valuable. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, everyone. And thanks, Hadrian and Jim, very much.
Yeah, I'd like to just offer my thanks too for everyone for joining today for the webinar. I think it was a good iteration out of the big stall from last week, actually action that we can get moving forward on. And I think this kind of work really helps with the arguments about the transition, just the kind of deep research and thought that needs to happen to make this thing reasonable and possible. So I'd like to thank Hadrian and Jim both, very insightful comments. I think everyone probably learned quite a bit today. And I'd highly recommend both Jim's paper. It's available, no doubt, on your website, Jim, on the Center for Future Work. And as well, the brochure that Environmental Defense put together is excellent, very nicely done, and contains a huge amount of information in the 20 pages that it is. I'd also recommend Hadrian's 2 reports that he's done, and we'll put the links to all those in the chat now as well. I'll try and get those up. Anyway, thanks so much, Jim. Thanks so much, Hadrian. It's been great.
Thank you for having us, for organizing this, and for all your campaigns. We depend so much on your activism. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Okay, bye for now.